go separate. Okay, friends, good morning. Yes, we're on. So I want to thank our Adult Ed Committee and Sarah Norris for putting this program together for us this morning. I'm going to guess that everyone here knows Dr. Klein, either as a patient, as a golf buddy, or a member of the congregation. In some way, you've had the pleasure of meeting an individual who's incredibly bright, is an author, writes with a sense of humor, whose work I've cited in the High Holiday Sermon, and is a real pleasure, a scholar and has saved many lives, and just really a pleasure to have him here this morning. And so without any further ado, I want to invite our special guests to share. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. We are live streaming this, but because of the nature, life is very political and controversial and everything else, we're not YouTubing it at this point. Okay, so those who can watch it live, great, and everybody else will miss the pleasure. Dr. Klein.
Thank you for that kind hyperbole, and I think with it you may have just turned an entire audience into a group of skeptics. Well, I'm honored and grateful to have been asked to speak with you today about medicine in a time of science denial. You know, given the prevalence of this topic around dinner tables and in the media of your choice, I fear I'll be teaching you very little new information that you haven't already had a chance to chew on and probably, like me, felt a little dyspeptic over. But maybe we can organize some thoughts around some subtopics that we will find worthy of our consumption. With the dawn of human consciousness came the very first scientific observation, a universal testimonial. The sun rose in an arc from the east and set in the west, incontrovertible evidence that the sun circled the earth. Replacing this theory with a heliocentric one, based on mathematics and observation, Galileo put his life in jeopardy. Later, he was forced to recant under the threat of torture, spending his final years under house arrest because of this heresy. A full, formal ratification of Galileo's proofs by the Catholic Church didn't take place until 1992, fully 350 years after his death. This reminds us that the human ego and institutional dogma are always slow to yield to inconvenient truths. So imagine this, it's the year 2026. We can sequence the human genome in hours. We can edit genes with CRISPR. We communicate across entire continents instantly. We live in an era that should be defined by the marvels of progress, and yet we find ourselves spending time debating the efficacy of basic public health tools, vaccines, masks, clean water, clean air, more than in any generation in the last century. We are fighting old battles with new, more dangerous weapons. Modern medicine is built on an edifice of science, randomized controlled trials, rigorous peer review, empirical evidence. This foundation has effectively doubled life expectancy in many parts of the globe in the last 100 years. But we face a paradox. The paradox is that we have unprecedented access to medical truth alongside unprecedented rejection of that truth. Often, it's a high-stake battle between biology and ideology, between science and political science, between the quantitative reality of the laboratory and the sensationalism of reality television. So let's begin by defining what science denial in medicine is. Here's what it is not. It's not healthy skepticism. Skepticism is the very heartbeat of the scientific method. Scientists are probably the original skeptics in the world. Uncertainty and distrust are woven into the very fabric of medical research. The scientific method actually begins with a humble admission of ignorance. A hypothesis is formed, methods and materials are outlined to try and disprove the concept, and results are observed and analyzed. Based on these findings, conclusions are either accepted, rejected, or refined. This willingness to be wrong is not a sign of weakness, it's the ultimate worship of truth. Conclusions in science, after all, are driven by data, not emotions. So what is science denial? Science denial is the rejection of a scientific consensus that was supported by overwhelming empirical evidence, where that rejection is driven by ideological, political, or financial motives. And it employs four predictable and probably very recognizable tactics. The first, attacking the integrity of the scientist. This is the classic ad hominem argument. If you can't disprove the data, you smear the person who collected it. You label them as shills for an industry or elites who are out of touch, effectively distracting the public from the evidence itself. And then there's magnifying minor disagreements. Look, in any healthy scientific community, there's always going to be debate over the margins. The exact dosing, the perfect drug, the actual timing, the ideal pH. Denialists will take this internal technical disagreement and amplify it to make it appear as though the entire foundation is crumbling, essentially creating a manufactured controversy. And then there's demanding impossible standards of proof. We know that the gold standard for medical experimentation is a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. Such designs, however, are sometimes impractical or frankly unethical. We can't, for example, ethically give half of a group of children a placebo when a life-saving vaccine for polio already exists, just to reprove the whole process. You know, I was a pre-med student in Canada in the 1960s before bypass surgery had actually been devised. And I attended a lecture by a professor named, very famous cardiac professor by the name of Arthur Weinberg. Weinberg believed and developed a technique in which he severed the distal end, the bottom end of the internal mammary artery, which is the artery that supplies blood to the chest wall. And he shoved that portion of it into an area of heart muscle that had been deprived of blood in order to kind of magically treat people with angina pectoris. And he did so hoping that there would be a regrowth of blood vessels in that area. And in fact, based on testimonials, 80 to 90% of those patients had a relief of their chest pain. But it wasn't until a group of Duke Medical School researchers, Donald, who reported results of their very interesting study. And this was blinded, so the patients had no idea which group they would be in. Half of the patients received the Weinberg surgery. The other half had their chest opened. The surgeon held their heart in his hand for a few minutes, and then the chest was closed again with doing nothing therapeutic. Relief of chest pain was identical in both groups, a purely placebo effect. And while this study did put an end to the useless Weinberg operation, the trauma and potential risks of such a sham surgery would be unthinkable today. Therefore, in situations like this, we often rely on large, balanced cohorts, which denialists would then dismiss as being merely observational. The fourth approach is to appeal to personal freedoms over collective well-being. So we see this when a public health mandate is equated to tyranny. When the Florida Surgeon General compares school vaccine requirements to slavery, he ignores the fact that your freedom to remain unvaccinated ends where it threatens my child's freedom to survive a preventable infection. It says as illogical as protesting speed limits is a violation of the right to drive however one pleases. So I think the lecture today is going to address the fact that science denial is no longer a peripheral task for medicine. It's not merely an annoying PR problem. It is central to our mission. In our hyper-connected, distrustful world, the primary challenge is not just the discovery of new cures, but the effective communication around and implementation of the cures we already have. So I'm going to divide the rest of this talk into three sections. The first is going to be to explore the golden age of medicine and the historical contract that it made with society. The second will be to examine some of the modern landscapes of denial, everything from anti-vax movement to climate health-driven crises. And then to discuss some of the profound consequences of this shift and the strategies that we might consider adopting to try to rebuild this bridge of trust. Science denial is not just a difference of opinion, it's a direct attack on the greatest public health achievements in human history. Before the 19th century, disease was shrouded in mystery and foul air and superstition. People believed in the concept of miasma, that bad smells caused plagues. One of those was cholera, until John Snow, a skeptic of the status quo, mapped out the outbreak in London and proved that it was waterborne, that it was related to the bacterium Vibrio cholera. At that time, doctors also believed in this concept of spontaneous generation, that life just kind of happened when they got to see maggots suddenly appear on the surface of rotting meat. Louis Pasteur famously disproved this by what was called the famous swan neck flask experiment. He took two flasks, which he filled with turbid broth, with clear broth. One flask had a straight neck that was exposed to the air, to dust particles and to bacteria, and the other one was arced or curved or swan neck, which trapped moisture and bacteria in the air. And as you might imagine, only the straight-necked flask turned turbid with bacteria. Later, Robert Koch developed his so-called postulates proving that specific organisms cause specific diseases. He cultured tissue from patients with tuberculosis in Petri dishes, and then he was able to reproduce that same disease in animals once they were inoculated with samples from this culture media. Joseph Lister reduced infection by sterilizing equipment, surgical equipment. And famously, Ignaz Semmelweis prevented infection by merely hand washing. Semmelweis was actually mocked and later committed to an asylum by his colleagues who felt that it was impossible for gentlemen's hands to become dirty. This work was not intuitive. These pioneers forced a radical change in human behavior. They forged a contract between science and society that saved lives and moved us from a world of seeing is believing to a world of you can't always believe your own eyes. Probably the crown jewel of this time period was the work of Edward Jenner, who, as you may know, was the person who discovered the concept of the vaccine for smallpox. But before I get to him, let me digress a little bit to perhaps a little-known snippet of history. 75 years before this, there was a concept of variolation, which was actually identified by a woman. Her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She married the grandson of the first Earl of Sandwich, who became the ambassador from England to Constantinople in the year 1716. She was a young woman, and she wrote incredibly wonderful descriptions, very vivid descriptions of life in Turkey at the time. And she was fascinated by the fact that some of the elder women would take samples of fluid from the blister of patients who had succumbed to smallpox, and that she then scratched the surface of their child's skin and applied it there. And these kids might have become mildly ill, but they all survived, and they actually developed lifelong immunity. She brought this concept back with her to London, and the doctors there were concerned about their reputation, and they were very reticent to do anything about this, not to mention the fact that there were plenty of anti-vaxxers in those days, especially the church, who was concerned that doing this would be against God's will. So instead, they brought this to the inmates of London's Newgate prison. And what they did is they offered this approach, this technique, to a number of the inmates who were scheduled to be executed. And the story was that if they were willing to do this and they survived, they would be pardoned. None of them succumbed. 75 years later, Edward Jenner comes along and notices that milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox, a much milder version, survived smallpox, and he then developed this vaccine. The cow that he used actually to do these studies was named Blossom, and there was an homage to Blossom because her hide now hangs proudly on the walls of St. George's Hospital Medical School in London. You may be interested to know that, of course, the Latin word for cow is vacca, which is where we get the word vaccine from. This led to the global eradication of a disease that killed 300 million people. This success was not a miracle of nature. It was a miracle of public trust and compliance. With these astonishing achievements in the 19th century, science developed an enlightenment contract with society. The contract codified the pledge: grant us the authority to act based on evidence, and we will deliver you longer, healthier lives. The outcomes speak for themselves. Antibiotics have conquered bacterial plagues that used to wipe out entire cities. Insulin transformed a death sentence into a manageable condition, and modern cardiology, statistics which I happen to be familiar with, has dramatically reduced heart disease mortality. Between 1970 and 2022 alone, we've witnessed a staggering 66% drop in overall age-adjusted mortality from heart disease. These are not opinions, this is not fake news. These are measurable historical triumphs of the scientific method. So if this has been so wonderful, why are there cracks in the society? Why is it fraying along the edges? The first is that success breeds complacency. A generation that has never seen a child in an iron lung or a person blinded by smallpox begins to view vaccines as optional or maybe unnecessary. When the horror of these diseases fades from living memory, the threat seems remote, and suddenly vaccines begin to look like the only threat. And then there's the rise of institutional distrust. I mean, every time a pharmaceutical company hides data to protect its profits, or a government agency like the CDC shifts its guidance without clear explanation, it provides oxygen for the denialist's fire and amplifies the quest to invalidate the entire scientific enterprise. And then there are renowned medical journals like The Lancet and the New England Journal that occasionally retract studies that have already been published and peer-reviewed. We saw this especially during COVID-19, when a number of slipshod studies were prompted by the imperative to publish quickly. Certainly an indictment of the individual study, and yet with their retraction, isn't this the testament to the integrity of a system that interrogates itself and corrects itself? The other problem is that, let's face it, medicine is complex. Modern medicine has moved from a simple germ meets body to more complicated stories. If we're dealing with messenger RNA and genomic sequencing and complex metabolic pathways, patients can understand that a drug works, but they may not be able to visualize how it works or why the process of proving it requires years of costly trials. I saw this sometimes within our own field. In my field, for example, years ago, we were told that beta blockers exacerbated congestive heart failure. And tons of papers based on testimonials showed that that was the case. In fact, stopping beta blockers really made people feel better. And then evidence-based trials came along and showed that beta blockers were the mainstay of treating congestive heart failure. You know, it always reminded me of that funny Woody Allen movie, Sleeper, where Woody comes back from time travel into the future in a capsule called an orgasmatron, smoking a cigarette, and he says, "Boy, can you believe that years ago people actually believed that smoking was bad for you?" Testimonials are not causality. Famously, after World War II, the birth rate in Germany dropped. And at that same time, the Audubon Society documented a steep decline in stork sightings. But based on these observations, we should not conclude that storks deliver babies. Complex relationships require controlled experiments and factor analysis to prove causality. So, when doctors can't give you a 100% guarantee, because remember, science deals with probabilities, not certainties, patients often flee to the absolute but false certainties offered by conspiracy theorists. Denialists' narrative is sticky because it's simple. If a person can't grasp the molecular biology of a vaccine, he might find it more emotionally charged to talk about vaccines altering DNA. Might find that more satisfying. This places the burden of clear, honest communication directly on us as physicians, as researchers, and as institutions. So let's talk for a few seconds about the modern manifestations of denial. Vaccine hesitancy and certainly anti-vaccination is at the front line of this war on evidence. Obviously, the pinnacle of this is MMR, the measles vaccine, and the autism myth. Despite the 1998 paper being retracted, debunked, revealed as a fraud, and its author having been stripped of his medical license, it continues to fuel global vaccine refusal. Decades later, its ghost still haunts every pediatric clinic. What's the reality of measles? We forget that measles is not just a childhood rash. It's a master of immune amnesia. The virus invades the T and B immune cells that travel to every organ in the body, the very cells that store your body's memory of how to fight other diseases. It can effectively reset your immune system, leaving a child vulnerable for every infection they've already fought off for the next 3 years. And during that vulnerable span, secondary bacterial infections like TB or viruses like the flu or polio or even encephalitis and death are more likely to occur. In contrast, the vaccine provides protection without erasing your immune memory. So denialists will also claim that some of these vaccines contain toxins like formaldehyde, ignoring the fact that certain fruit, like a single pear, contains more naturally occurring formaldehyde than a dozen vaccines. MMR is one of the world's most scrutinized vaccines. Global monitoring systems like the Vaccine Adverse Reporting System and the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and multiple clinical trials with tens of thousands of patients across all demographics have shown and documented its safety and value. The measles remains one of the leading causes of death globally among young children, with outbreaks noted in populations where vaccination has fallen below 95%. After 60 years of peer review, it's clear that this vaccine does more than prevent a rash. I just happened to look up the other day what some of the numbers were in terms of measles outbreak. At this time last year, we were at 120 cases in the United States. As of yesterday, we're up to 1,362 cases. So it kind of gives you an idea, and 92% of those were unvaccinated. So the next question is to talk a little bit about very politicized lab COVID-19 vaccinations. And during the pandemic, denial moved from niche groups to the center of the political discourse. And we saw belief replace biology, treatments like hydroxychloroquine and Clorox and ivermectin became tokens of loyalty despite vigorous studies showing that ineffectiveness or harm took place while trying to treat the virus. Unlike scientists who adjusted their hypothesis as the virus mutated, proponents of these impromptu and somewhat quixotic treatments refused to recant even after the data was refuted. Saving face became more important than saving lives. To be fair, physicians were on a steep learning curve too, and the CDC, believe me, did not always get it right. In retrospect, perhaps all of the measures we were asked to adopt were not ideal or necessary or maybe even draconian as information changed with experience and the virus evolved. But given the risk to the public of the unknown, the CDC had to consider the fact that there is no R value around death. Death is absolute. And the mortality gap was the ultimate proof. Vaccinated states saw a 74% lower risk of death from severe COVID. In a world of science, we can compare the outcomes in a study that followed 22.7 million vaccinated versus 5.9 million unvaccinated. In a world of denial, they can look at one rare side effect like myocarditis and call that the real story. And then there's the issue of denial in chronic diseases and lifestyle. It involves rejecting evidence-based interventions in favor of magical thinking related to unsupported diets or supplements. I have a personal situation where I've seen a number of patients with severe coronary artery blockages who were told to believe in an infusion of a substance called chelation therapy. Chelation is related to a medication called EDTA, and that was supposed to bind calcium and collapse the plaques and remove the plaques from your coronary arteries. And that would obviate the need for intensive medical therapy, for stents, or for bypass surgery. In some, this misguided trust in the potion delayed critical treatment, and in a few, postponing real therapy cost them their lives. Let's talk for a second about Tylenol in pregnancy and autism. So R.F. Kennedy has recently pushed this idea that Tylenol in pregnancy could cause autism, and he ignores the confounding evidence that women take Tylenol because they have high fevers. An untreated high fever is a known cause of preterm labor, miscarriage, neural tube defects, and other congenital abnormalities. So by telling women to avoid the fever reduction, he's potentially causing the very neurodevelopmental harm he attempts to prevent. So recently, there have been some very robust sibling-controlled trials where they have shared environment and shared genetics. And in a mother who took Tylenol with one child while she was pregnant and another time when she did not, there is no link and no difference between the incidence of autism. Recommendations to withhold Tylenol in pregnant women, especially with high fevers, is non-science and is nonsense. People pay a lot of money for cleanses. You may remember the very famous name Nathan Pritikin. Didn't go to medical school, actually didn't graduate from college, although he was a pretty bright entrepreneur and an inventor. And he developed the so-called Pritikin diet, which actually, cardiac-wise, is a good diet. Patients walked on a treadmill. They were admitted to his clinic, which, by the way, if you're a frequent traveler to California, is now the Hotel Casa del Mar in Santa Monica. They stayed on his diet for 2 weeks, were walked on a treadmill the second time, and guess what? The diet must have worked because they all got better. Of course, he took advantage of the well-known phenomenon of the training effect. Everybody does better on the treadmill the second time around. So there were no crossover trials, there were no control groups. And in another testimonial, he personally predicted that his own autopsy would prove how great his diet was in cleaning out coronary arteries. And when he died of leukemia, his arteries were in fact clean. His followers claimed that this proved that the diet worked. And while it is true that his diet was healthy for the heart, any scientist could just as easily look at that data and conclude that his diet caused leukemia. Some observations are true, but not all are evidence-based. While often seen as a purely environmental issue, climate change is fundamentally a public health crisis. Denying climate change is denying the expansion of diseases like Lyme disease, valley fever, West Nile virus, malaria, Zika and dengue fever into the southern United States, or chikungunya fever, which is now devastating Cuba. It's denying the air quality that is currently affecting patients with COPD and asthma. It's denying the mental health crisis of displacement. Recent revocation of aspects of the Clean Air Act that monitor greenhouse gas emissions, and a pullback of some of the water regulations that oversee wetlands and threaten pollution with toxic chemicals, wastewater, and heavy metals is no way to make America healthy again. So what are the engines of denial? Algorithms and echo chambers. You know, in 1950, we had 3 television channels and hopefully 1 trusted family physician. Today, we have algorithms that prioritize engagement, emotionally charged, sensational, and often false information that makes us angry, generates more interest than a dry, nuanced scientific report. People trust a charismatic influencer and a friend's Facebook page more than an institution or a scientist with a white coat. We have decentralized authority and awarded it to the most entertaining voice. The solution, I think, is not to censor, but to flood the zone with better, more human, and more relatable communication. We understand that there's a significant consequence to denial, and it's measurable. We're seeing, as I said, a resurgence in measles, mumps, pertussis diseases that were once effectively conquered in communities with low rates. But we're also facing an erosion of trust. If a patient believes that their doctor's intentionally lying about a flu shot, it erodes everything else, his interest in surgery, chemotherapy, and chronic care. And this leads, amongst other things, to profound physician burnout. We're losing brilliant researchers who are being replaced by those who prioritize alternative science over evidence. If the CDC and the NIH are hollowed out, who will set the standard of care? If a doctor follows evidence-based science, but a politician sets a different official approach, the doctor is left in a legal and moral wilderness. So the doctors, many of my friends, understand what it means to be physician as communicator. But as part of all of this, there is an acronym called PACE, P-A-C-E, which has been used as a method, as a mechanism designed to shift the dynamic conversation in a one-on-one doctor-patient relationship from debate over fact to dialogue over shared values. So when science denial enters the room or the public square, the goal is to lower the patient's threshold of threat so that they can actually begin to process some of the information you tell them. You know, I recently heard about a doctor who had a coffee mug prominently placed on his desk that read, "Don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree." Clever, but maybe not the best way to minimize threat and open up a dialogue. So PACE assumes that denial, science denial, is rarely about the lack of information. It's about tribalism and identity. So let's look at the acronym P for prepare. Anticipate the fear. Let's not be surprised when we hear the words autism and toxin and personal choice as an argument. We should lead with a fact, briefly mention why that myth is wrong, and end with the fact again. But how do we package the fact? Statistics appeal to the brain, but human stories appeal to the heart. And let's face it, denial is an emotional state. A for acknowledge. This is the bridge. We might say something like, quote, "I can see you've done a lot of research because you want the best for your child. It's overwhelming how much conflicting information there is out there." Here, we're validating their love and concern, not their misinformation. And if we can acknowledge that both the denier and the doctor want the same thing, safety, health, autonomy, it may be possible to find common ground. C, again, because it's so important, communicate. Using analogies and understandable language, again, we're taught to lead with the truth, demystify the misinformation, and then reiterate the consensus. And finally, E for empathy, empathize. This is, in fact, a long game. Even if a patient refuses our advice today, convincing may take time. Finally, beyond the individual doctor-patient relationship, we need some normalization of policy and systemic solutions. We need institutions, universities, hospitals, professional agencies to take communication as seriously as they do research. We should be teaching our children in middle school how to recognize, how to spot fake news tactics before they encounter it. We ought to be rewarding scientists who engage with the public, who write for popular media, and who are effective communicators. And to this point, many medical institutions are already publishing their own health guidelines to counter recent recommendations from the federal government. You may have read that here in 2026, there's been a significant divergence in the CDC versus other societies like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the AMA in how many vaccinations a child needs. The CDC has reduced it from 17 down to 11, and the American Academy of Pediatrics has actually increased it to 18, now adding RSV to its list. Responding even further, the AMA and others have begun building a parallel infrastructure for scientific review. An example of this is the Vaccine Integrity Project, which is a project that partners the AMA and the University of Minnesota to launch an independent, evidence-based review process for vaccines. This to provide a gold standard to help guide doctors, patients, and state health officials. And the AMA's suggestions of increasing the vaccines to 18 has now been formally endorsed by 12 major medical institutions, including the Infectious Diseases Society of America. These institutions were once thought of as isolated, insulated towers of research. These organizations now need to take their expertise to the public arena, asserting their duty to provide science-based guidance to protect the public health. We ought to remember that denialists are loud, but they are not the majority. I'd like to think that doctors are still trusted. Our goal is to protect that silent majority by being relentlessly honest and deeply human. I don't think we need any more data points. We need more trust points. The battle for medicine in a time of science denial is not just fought in the laboratory anymore. It's fought in the public arena. It is a reminder that the greatest medical achievements are wasted if they are not accepted. Our path forward is to combine the rigor of the laboratory with the warmth of the bedside, not to simply have more facts, but to show more humanity in how we share them. Thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, yes.
I'm going to ask you. Well, I didn't realize that long. You used the mic.
Okay. Not a question, but related. There's been a marked reduction in funding for research. For example, Cancer Society, Cancer Institute. Do you have any thoughts as to how that impacts what you're talking about and how it will impact the future of American medicine?
It's a good question. It's got to be devastating, right? I mean, we're going in the wrong direction. These funds are vital for research. A lot of the funding has actually stopped research midway, in mid-portion, so it's actually not just diminished the overall impact on the healthcare of the country, but they've actually had to dismantle you probably saw this at Harvard recently, they've had to dismantle all sorts of laboratories who are halfway through or partway through or three-quarters towards a goal. Research is like, you know this from your own son, research is like a brick in a building. You start taking out some of the bricks and the building collapses. So, you know, I don't understand the rationale for these things. Money is tight wherever it is, and there are ways to affect it, but that's not the best way to do it.
How long do you think it would take us, will take us to recover from brain drain?
I don't know. Some of it is drained out of me, actually, as I get older. I don't know. I think it's a long process. You know, for a while in medical school and then as a postdoc, I spent some time in London, doing some research in London. And one of the horrible concerns of what took place there was the brain drain in England. Everybody was coming to the United States, and when they suddenly reached the pinnacle or they were getting ready to have a great idea, they realized that there was no funding for it, or there was no expertise, and there was a direct train that came straight to the United States. As that kind of reverses, I'm sure it takes decades.
Okay, I'm interested in what you were talking about a little while ago about the PACE, P-A-C-E. How do you see that playing out in what students are being taught now in medical school? Because I go to multiple doctors. Some of my doctors listen when I talk and make cogent responses and are paying attention to me. And one or two are like, oh, I know best for you, so let me just do my thing. And obviously, unless it's absolutely necessary, I don't go back to that doctor. But this is a skill that you don't, or at least when I was growing up and people were going to medical school, was not being taught. And so the empathy part, the communication part is vital if you want to survive as a practicing physician, not necessarily a research physician, but definitely as a practicing physician. So is that happening?
It's a really good question. Actually, I wrote a book about the subject called Handle with Care, which actually spends a lot of time talking about the then versus the now, and what are the reasons for the new doctor-patient relationship? What presaged that? I'd like to think that some of that is changing. Some of it has to do with, amongst other things, the idea that you swipe right for a piece of information nowadays as opposed to spending a lot of time digging. And so the quick answer, the quick result, the quick response, the ability to type and never look up, that has obviously taken over a lot of medicine, and some of this is the pressure of time. You would think that if you had access to the computer technology that we have in search engines, that you would actually have more time rather than less time. However, that hasn't always translated into the way doctors have taken care of their patients nowadays. I will say that I went back to my medical school reunion a couple of years ago. It was my 50th year reunion, believe it or not. And it was really interesting because when I was in medical school, we had to do a research project, which is almost the equivalent of a PhD, was several years worth of research in order to graduate. And almost all of us did stuff that had to do with biochemistry and sort of deeply research-oriented kinds of things. We asked some of the third-year medical students who would now just be graduating whether that still took place. And they said, yes, we have projects now, but it was amazing how all of them were about compassion. They were doing social studies related to compassion, and I think that they perceive a void. They see that there is a void, and they need to fill that void. I'm hopeful that that will change. I'm hopeful that we're going through a kind of a dark ages of empathy, and that will ultimately change. I hope that that's the case. Done.
Hello. Are there any vaccines in the U.S. today that are mandatory?
I don't think so.
And in the past, they were some vaccines that were mandatory.
They were in order to go to school. Yeah, you had to take.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are some. Well, I can say that they are mandatory in some states, but not in all. In Florida now, they're not. They're not mandatory. In other states, they probably are in order to go to school.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. Listen, there are physicians, there are researchers who are very good at communicating. They've just been communicating within their own group. They're getting up in front of 2,000 people and talking about science. There should be, and I hope there will be, I hope these institutions actually begin to foster some people who are good at the general communication to the world. A number of years ago, you may remember the name Richard Dawkins, who was a scientist par excellence. He became the science spokesperson for the UK. Nobody could probably be more eloquent and more wonderful at being able to communicate complex problems to, you may not have always agreed with him, but complex issues to explain them to the Commonwealth. We ought to have people like that. I mean, there are a few, but the Sanjay Guptas of the world, whoever, those kinds of people need to go out and talk about the difference between science and non-science.
My question is, I would love to hear your thoughts and your opinion about the number of medications that are prescribed and that people are taking.
Well, I don't know how to respond to that, actually. Listen, I think polypharmacy is a problem. But the problem is that people have, as we age in particular, we're adding to a list of diseases that we also have to respond to. And I think, like anything else, I think the biggest problem has always been that every time you go to a new doctor or to a new physician, to a new subspecialist, they don't take anything away, they usually add something, right? And sometimes it has to do with the time on task to sit down and say, let's kind of review this and see if we're duplicating, if there's something that's unnecessary. If this didn't work, let's get rid of it, or it got added to a list that you don't even remember what it was used for. So some of this is responding to your question of time on task. Even though it's been many years since I've retired, it's not a week or two goes by when somebody doesn't send me their medical data to say, could you look over this and see what's wrong? And a lot of times it's stopping something, not starting something. So that's an issue, but it takes time. It's a problem.
Hi. My question, I keep hearing sound bites about microplastics. And I'm wondering, is it real? Is it not real? And I don't know who the authorities are.
Well, it's not me. I'm pretty sure it's not me. Look, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think like anything else, when you hear data, you need to know where the data came from. So I think there is probably some of that that is true, and I suspect it probably is. But it's just a suspicion, and I would just urge you to go to the data and identify where it came from, rather than taking a soundbite, like any other conspiracy or like any other scary process that you need to deal with. So,
aren't there still some vaccinations you need to take if you want to travel to other countries? Are they still in practice?
Yeah, I think on a country-by-country basis, yes, there certainly are. Not just some that you need to take, but some that you ought to be taking. I mean, that's why these tropical medicine travel programs at Methodist and at almost every major institution nowadays will give you an idea of what month yellow fever or malaria or whatever is most prevalent in that area. And that's part of the problem of what we were just talking about now, is that what used to be the case 10 years ago is probably different now, because if you went to Cuba 5 years ago, chikungunya fever wouldn't be an issue for you to worry about. Today, it's devastating the country, and it's a pretty nasty disease. So I think on a case-by-case basis, at a hospital on a country-by-country basis, you know, you're wise if you're getting ready to go someplace, to go to a consultant and make sure that a travel consultant, to make sure you're getting the right thing.
Are the medical institutions, like we have the major hospitals in Houston, and I would assume at their leadership, they don't necessarily agree with all these new ideas, but are they capable or willing to challenge these ideas and try to provide the leadership that you're asking for to, or are they just afraid, they're concerned about if they speak out, they're going to lose more money?
I don't think any physicians that I know or that we know together are worried about whether speaking out or not. Almost all of the doctors that I look at, some of the stuff that you hear about in the news, some of these bizarre ideas about autism and so forth, none of that makes sense to them. And I think Methodist Hospital or Herman Hospital, any of the large institutions here, will go on and do what they think is the right thing to do vis-a-vis vaccinations, et cetera. And now that, as I said, now that there are these projects that are designed to kind of re-examine or fortify the data that has led medical decision-making over the last many decades, I think that will help support and underwrite all of that and underscore it. As I said, there are 12 major medical institutions in the United States that have agreed with the Academy of Pediatrics and have agreed with the AMA and have disagreed with the CDC, and I think they're going to lead the fight here in a way that hasn't been the case up until now. I don't think so. I don't think they're based in Houston, no.
You mentioned PACE, and the C stands for communication, and I think that I'd like to hear your perspective about how the medical profession is going to communicate complex terminology in a simple way that debunks the deniers. And the person that I think of most is Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astronomer,
the physicist,
who has the ability to take a very complex scientific arena and put it down in very simple terms that most people can understand. How is the medical profession going to do the same thing?
Yeah, you know, it's a skill set, obviously, and on a one-on-one basis. I don't know that anybody's going to publish a guideline to respond to every one of the questions that patients will ever have. But I'm not really sure that people need to know the complexities of the way messenger RNA works. I don't think they need to know that necessarily. That's not really what they're driving at. I think they need to know that messenger RNA-based vaccines, for example, don't destroy your DNA. I think there are ways to describe that are very simple, that, you know, where the DNA comes from and how it works. That does take time, and that's the problem. You know, astrophysicists have a chance to write a book and have plenty of airtime. They don't have a room full of patients waiting for them, and so they have that access, they have the ability to do that, and he's obviously gifted in a lot of ways. But I think this comment that I made earlier about using stories, there are lots of ways to use stories that are very helpful. In my own practice, I used to use automobile driving as a way of describing what happened to your coronary arteries. You know, what off-ramps look like and what blockages look like and what happens if you had 2 out of 4 lanes were obstructed and was there still traffic problems. There are ways that you can do that. People say, oh, now I can visualize what that's about. And so using stories and using analogies that make sense without all of the Latin phrases is probably the best way to do it. I'm hoping that medical schools are starting to teach some of that and that people will see the benefits that come from that.
Last 2
Hi. Wanted to respond to what are medical schools doing. I'm not sure, but I will tell you that part of the medical school application process is the students have to take an exam called the Casper exam, or there's other ones that are supposedly assessing their ability for empathy, communication skills, teamwork, leadership, resilience, adaptability. Now, what medical schools do with the results of that exam and who they accept is, I don't know. I also want to speak to this whole denial thing. I'm a psychologist and I work with medically ill people for 27 years. And so I hear this every day in my office, whether people do not want to take psychiatric medication, or I work with cancer patients. So there's a lot of, I'm not taking this, I'm not taking tamoxifen, I'm not, everything. I'm going to Mexico. I've heard it all. It's frustrating, but what I have found is similar maybe to this PACE, which I'd never heard of, but I listen to them. I have found that when I come up with facts, they're just going to push back, that human beings are very complex in why they believe what they believe, or why they deny, or what the fear is about. It could be historical. There's so many reasons to every individual. I let it play out. I give the stories, for every story they have about some woman who had a horrible reaction to tamoxifen for breast cancer prevention, I give other stories at how helpful that is. So I've decided at this point, I just wait and wait and wait. They could say, I don't want psych meds, I don't want this. But then when their symptoms don't change, or when they get ill, or when they have a recurrence, it's almost they have to have the negative consequences to maybe have a mind shift. It's about trust in the physicians and me too, to who are they going to listen to. I think, because I hear complaints about physicians, I think more and more I'm hearing more compassionate physicians. They're wanting to listen, at least for the cancer patients. Many are open to alternative and complementary aspects to care, and they're opening to hear and allowing their patients to take complementary, meds or whatever they're doing, as long as they know. And I find that that's more and more. So I have some hope, I guess, overall.
Well, that's my point exactly, that the idea that you can counter conversations that are negative with data and with facts and statistics doesn't mean a thing. Stories. This is an emotional problem, and it's best, I think, dealt with an emotional response.
I'm also a retired cardiologist, and I agree with what you've said, but unfortunately, I've never been convinced after practicing for 50 years that you can teach empathy, and I'd like to think that the test is selecting for it. I think you either come into school with empathy or you don't. There are exceptions, obviously, but it's very important. I'm not denying that.
And I think the other point is that we are often, guided by our mentors. And so if you have somebody who you looked up to, as I know you did and I did, people who you really wanted to emulate, you wanted to know, you wanted to catch the dust from a fleck of dust that came off of their heel as they walked by. You wanted to be like them. You wanted to know what they knew. And if that kind of a person could show empathy, it's a learning moment, it's a teachable moment, and it has to be nurtured, it has to be at the right time, it has to germinate at the right moment. But I think that kind of mentorship is a very important part of it. And let's face it, you and I know, because I know the people you trained with, same with me, weren't necessarily the most empathetic. They were brilliant, but boy, not exactly empathetic. That's something that you had to relearn, and maybe it was in your DNA, as I know it was for you. But I think that mentorship is going to make a big difference.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
It's a pleasure.
And Dr. Klein, thank you. Every time you speak, I come away, one, inspired, and two, researching 3 more books because you've provoked new thoughts in my head. And so very much appreciative. Thank you all for staying on task in the questions as well. And we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks.